We have the money. She suspects absolutely nothing. Friday we sign and the house is ours." Those were the exact words written on a piece of heavy, textured cream cardstock. I remember the physical weight of that paper between my fingers, the way the expensive cotton-pressed grain felt beneath my thumb. I was 42 years old. I was standing perfectly still in the narrow hallway of my own home in Tucson, Arizona, wearing heavy, steel-toed work boots, my hands wrapped around the cold, rubberized grip of a yellow Stanley crowbar. My fingers were coated in a thick, white, chalky layer of drywall dust. Every time I inhaled, my lungs burned from the fine, dry particulate matter suspended in the stagnant air. It was exactly 3:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. The brutal afternoon sun was baking the terracotta tiles in the kitchen, radiating a stifling heat that crept down the corridor and wrapped around my ankles. The light sliced through the half-open blinds, casting long, harsh, geometric shadows across the wooden floorboards. I wasn't supposed to be home. I was supposed to be across town, processing a scene. And I certainly wasn't supposed to be swinging a solid steel bar, smashing a ragged, gaping hole into the pristine wall of the historic house I had spent 6 brutal years paying off. But I did. And inside that dark, hollow void in the wall, wedged tightly between a rough-hewn 2x4 stud and the oxidized green of old copper plumbing, was a heavy black fireproof document bag. It smelled faintly of fiberglass and secrets. Inside the bag was that cardstock note, along with a thick stack of stapled bank transfers that made my stomach hit the floor so violently I thought I might actually vomit right there in the settling dust. A cold, sharp sweat broke out across the back of my neck. My pulse hammered in my ears, a frantic, rhythmic thud that temporarily drowned out the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. 4 hours later, my husband would walk through that heavy oak front door, carrying a grease-stained brown bag of expensive, fragrant garlic takeout, wearing his custom-tailored charcoal suit, perfectly ready to play the role of the loving, exhausted partner. When he finally saw the jagged hole in the wall, his face underwent a horrifying transformation, draining to the pale, lifeless color of wet cement. But by then, it was way too late. The trap was already set, the jaws pulled back and locked. To understand why this precise moment, this brutal, suffocating discovery in the sweltering heat of my own hallway, was actually the greatest tactical advantage I could have ever asked for. You need to know what I do for a living. Because my husband thought he was married to a compliant, emotionally exhausted woman who just took boring pictures for the county. He vastly, fatally underestimated what I actually do. My name is Corin Gable. I am a crime scene photographer for the Pima County Sheriff's Department. If you watch police procedurals on television, you probably think my job is glamorous. You probably picture me stepping out of a sleek, air-conditioned black SUV and designer sunglasses, snapping a few high-contrast artistic photos of a pristine, dramatically lit room, and then delivering a witty, cynical one-liner before going out for craft cocktails with handsome detectives. The reality is entirely different. The reality is smelling the suffocating metallic tang of raw copper and sweet decay at 3 a.m. in a cramped, unventilated trailer park, fighting the urge to gag while flies buzz aggressively against the windows. It is kneeling in the loose, gritty dirt in the middle of the Sonora Desert in late July, with the ambient temperature hovering at a blistering 106 degrees, photographing overlapping tire tracks while salty sweat stings my eyes and soaks through the heavy fabric of my uniform. It is standing in pitch-black rooms using alternate light sources, blinding UV and infrared wands, to illuminate the horrific, glowing smears that desperate people tried so hard to scrub away with industrial bleach and frantic hands. My job is entirely about noticing what does not belong. I document the physical space after extreme violence or desperate deceit has occurred. I look for the microscopic disruptions in the natural, everyday pattern of a room. A black rubber scuff mark on a white baseboard. A heavy wool rug that has been shifted exactly 2 inches to the left, revealing a slightly cleaner, less sun-faded square of hardwood beneath it. A partial, oily fingerprint on the inside of a door frame positioned at an awkward angle that suggests someone was trying to brace their body weight against a struggle, not just passing through the threshold. I am paid by the county to be hyper-observant. I am paid to let the cold, hard physical evidence speak, because the dead cannot utter a single word, and the living usually lie through their teeth. I didn't know it then, standing in the dust of my hallway, but this specific occupational hazard, this absolute inability to turn off my analytical assessing brain, would be the only thing standing between me and total financial annihilation. I wasn't always this clinical, this detached. Growing up, my life was a hurricane of chaos. My mother was a fragile, erratic woman who chased charming bad men across state lines in beat-up sedans. By the time I was 14 years old, we had lived in 6 different states, mostly bouncing between cheap, neon-lit motels or rented rooms that permanently smelled like stale cigarette smoke, damp carpet, and quiet desperation. I never had a bedroom I could paint a color of my choosing. I never had a solid wall I could hang a poster on without the lingering, nauseating fear that we'd have to pack our garbage bags and run in the middle of the night because the rent was due, or a man had turned mean. Because of that profound instability, I developed a singular, obsessive dream. I wanted a home. A permanent, heavy, unmovable house. I wanted thick adobe walls that absorbed the sound of the world. I wanted a legally binding deed with my name printed on it in heavy black ink. I wanted a concrete foundation that could not be taken away from me by anyone, ever. When I finally got hired by the county lab at 26, I started saving with a ferocity that bordered on clinical madness. I ate cheap rice and canned beans for dinner 6 nights a week. I drove a battered 1998 Honda Civic with a broken AC unit, which during an Arizona summer is practically a medieval form of self-flagellation, leaving my back constantly plastered to the cheap fabric seats. I worked every single gruesome holiday overtime shift the department offered. It was during my very first year on the job that I met Detective Eris Thorne. He was a veteran homicide detective, a grizzled, broad-shouldered guy who permanently smelled of cheap tobacco and drank his Kiwi Black from a dented thermos. He spoke in gravelly, impatient half-sentences. But he became my mentor. He taught me how to read the psychology of a room before I ever raised the heavy viewfinder of my camera to my eye. I remember the specific night Eris gave me the advice that would save my life. We were standing in the cramped, blood-spattered living room of a suspect who claimed his wife had fallen. The air smelled like copper and cheap pine cleaner. Eris pointed a calloused, thick finger at a perfectly clean corner of a glass coffee table. "Look at the table, Gable. What do you see?" I adjusted my camera strap, wiping a bead of sweat from my temple. Blood spatter on the magazines. A knocked-over lamp. The rug is bunched up. "Look at the corner," Eris grunted, taking a sip from his thermos. "The dust." I leaned in, shining my flashlight. "It's clean. A perfect square. Something was sitting there." "Exactly," Eris said, his eyes narrowing. "A liar always forgets one corner of the room. They wipe the weapon, they bleach the floor, they rehearse their tears. They focus on the big narrative, but they always miss the dust, remember that." "They can't control every variable," I murmured, snapping a photo of the clean square. "Nobody can," he replied, turning toward the door. "Human panic is sloppy. The truth is always in the margins." I had no idea how much that one brief exchange would matter. I had no idea I'd be applying his gravelly wisdom to the foundation of my own marriage. I met Julian when I was 35. I had just managed to buy my absolute dream house. It was a beautiful, sprawling 1920s Spanish colonial situated in a quiet, historic neighborhood of Tucson. It needed work, a staggering amount of work, but the bones were magnificent. It had a shaded interior courtyard paved with cracked terracotta, thick adobe walls that kept the interior wonderfully cool, and a massive, ancient mesquite tree in the front yard that dropped delicate yellow leaves on the walkway. I drained every single penny of my savings to put down the massive deposit, and I loved every single cracked tile and creaky floorboard in that place. It smelled of aged wood and dry earth. It was mine. Julian was a high-end contractor and local real estate developer. He specialized in restoring historic desert properties. We met when I hired his boutique firm to give me a structural estimate on reinforcing the sagging original roof. He was charming. God, he was effortlessly charming. He walked through my dusty, half-gutted living room wearing a crisp, perfectly fitted linen shirt and expensive leather boots, running his manicured hands over the original, deeply scarred woodwork with what looked like genuine, breathless reverence. He didn't look at the crumbling house like it was a financial burden. He looked at it like it was a priceless masterpiece waiting to be gently uncovered. And, to my utter detriment, he looked at me the exact same way. Our early days were intoxicating, a whirlwind of attention and warmth. He would show up at my house after my grueling 12-hour shifts carrying steaming Sonoran hot dogs wrapped in bacon and ice-cold Mexican cervezas. We would sit cross-legged on the bare floor of my empty living room surrounded by scattered paint swatches, measuring tapes, and architectural blueprints, eating and laughing until 2 a.m. He was endlessly patient. He was financially successful. He seemed like the heavy, immovable anchor I had been desperately searching for my entire life. Looking back, the warning was right there, flashing in bright neon. I just chose to squint and see it as a quirky character trait. During our third date, we were sitting in a plush leather booth at a high-end steakhouse downtown. The air smelled of charred ribeye, melted butter, and expensive red wine. He was telling an animated story about a particularly difficult, wealthy client, and he casually mentioned how he had rearranged some budget lines. "So," Julian said, taking a slow sip of his bourbon, the ice clinking against the crystal glass. "I just rearranged the budget lines. The client is paying for the premium Italian marble, but they think it's the standard ceramic." I paused, my fork hovering over my plate. "Wait, you billed them for one thing and bought another?" Julian laughed, a rich, easy sound. "I upgraded them, Corinne. They're getting a significantly better product. I'm just absorbing the margin differently so they don't panic at the sticker shock." "But the invoice doesn't actually reflect that," I said, a tiny cold prickle of unease forming at the back of my neck. "Isn't that technically fraud?" Julian reached across the white linen tablecloth and squeezed my hand, offering a dazzling, reassuring smile. "People only see the numbers you want them to see, honey. It's creative accounting. Everyone in the development game does it. It hurts no one." My cop brain whispered violently, "That's a crime. That's literal deception. He is showing you how easily he manipulates reality." But my lonely, hopeful heart shouted it down. "He's just exaggerating for the story. He's a sharp businessman. This is how the wealthy world works. Stop interrogating your date." I told myself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was the prologue. We got married 2 years later. It was a beautiful, intimate ceremony held right in our interior courtyard under the string lights. By then, the house was fully, gloriously restored. And because I had received a modest, unexpected inheritance from a great aunt and continued working massive, exhausting overtime shifts, the house was entirely paid off. No mortgage, no bank. It was mine. Well, ours. I had voluntarily put his name on the deed after the wedding because that's what you do when you deeply trust someone, right? You share the foundation. You give them half your safety. For the first 4 years of our marriage, we were incredibly happy, or at least the glossy illusion of happiness was absolutely flawless. Julian's development business was booming, expanding across the state. He was constantly traveling up Interstate 10 to Phoenix and Scottsdale to look at lucrative new commercial properties. I was endlessly busy at the county lab and out in the field. We had a rhythm. We had a life. But then, the steady rhythm started to skip. The behavioral changes started incredibly small. So small you could easily convince yourself you were just overtired from working a triple homicide. The first shift was the cell phone. Julian had always been one of those relaxed guys who tossed his phone onto the kitchen granite island, face up, completely unbothered by incoming notifications. Then, right around our 5th anniversary, I noticed a distinct change. It was always face down, always in his front pocket, always locked with a new, complex passcode. Specific moment. We were eating dripping carne asada tacos at a noisy food truck we loved on 4th Avenue. The smell of roasting meat and cilantro hung heavy in the warm night air. His phone buzzed loudly against the metal table. Before I could even casually glance at the illuminated screen, his hand shot out like a desert rattlesnake striking, snatching the device and violently shoving it into his jacket pocket. "Work," he said, his jaw tight. his eyes refusing to meet mine. Clients have absolutely no boundaries these days. I didn't say anything. I just watched him chew his food, noticing how the tendons in his neck were rigid, how his breathing had suddenly become shallow. The second sign was the sudden, overwhelming, suffocating generosity. Out of nowhere, Julian started buying me wildly expensive things I didn't ask for and didn't need. A gleaming $2,000 Italian espresso machine. A designer leather handbag that smelled like a luxury showroom and cost more than my first car. A surprise weekend spa retreat in the Red Rocks of Sedona. Guilt gifts. I had seen them 100 times in the domestic disturbance cases I photographed. The husband hits the wife. He buys her 24 roses. The husband cheats with the secretary. He buys diamond earrings. The mechanics of human guilt are universal, pathetic, and entirely predictable. I told myself I was being overly cynical. Turn off the crime scene brain, I whispered to myself in the mirror. He's just being a nice husband. Let yourself be loved. The third sign was the fracture. The exact moment the hairline crack appeared in the glass and the freezing cold air rushed in. It was a Tuesday night in late November. I had just come home from a horrific, bloody scene, a cartel-related double homicide in a dusty industrial warehouse. I smelled like iron, ozone, and unwashed bodies. I was exhausted down to my very marrow. I walked heavily into the master bathroom, eager to strip off my contaminated clothes and stand under boiling water. I opened the top vanity drawer to grab my gentle face wash. Sitting right on top of my neatly folded stack of white washcloths was a small, sleek, silver tube of lipstick. It wasn't mine. I don't wear lipstick. I wear cherry chapstick and SPF 50 sunscreen. I picked it up. The metal casing was heavy, expensive, a high-end French brand. I popped the cap. The bright red shade was called Crimson Fire. I stared at the waxy pigment. The spacious bathroom suddenly felt very small, the walls pressing inward. The low hum of the ceiling ventilation fan sounded like a roaring jet engine in my ears. My hands went completely, numbingly cold. I walked out to the living room, my boots heavy on the hardwood. Julian was casually watching a college basketball game on the massive flat screen, a crystal glass of amber scotch loosely held in his hand. I held up the silver tube, the metal catching the light. What is this? He glanced at it, and for a fraction of a second, a fleeting micro-expression that I am professionally trained by the county to catch, his pupils dilated and his eyes widened in pure, unfiltered panic. But his recovery was instantaneous. The muscles in his face smoothed out into a flawless mask of mild, dismissive confusion. "Oh," Julian chuckled, waving his free hand dismissively in the air. "That must be Sabrina's. She was over here earlier going over the plumbing blueprints for the Catalina Foothills project." Sabrina, his newly hired staging director and interior designer. She was 28, permanently smelled like expensive cedar and vanilla perfume, and possessed the intellectual depth of a decorative throw pillow. "She was keeping her lipstick in my vanity drawer?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, flat register. "Right next to my face wash?" Julian sighed, the heavy, exaggerated, theatrical sigh of a rational man burdened by a deeply unreasonable woman. "Corinne, come on. It probably fell out of her purse when she was touching up her makeup." "Her purse was inside my closed bathroom vanity?" I asked, my eyes locked onto his. Julian shifted his weight on the sofa, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Why are you making this a massive thing? You're seeing shadows again, Corinne." "Shadows don't wear crimson fire, Julian. That morbid, depressing job of yours is making you clinically paranoid," he snapped, taking a hard swallow of his scotch. "You look for crime everywhere, you look for the worst in everyone. Just drop it, okay? I'm exhausted." "You're seeing shadows, Corinne." That was his favorite pet phrase. Whenever I noticed a discrepancy in his stories, whenever I questioned a financial anomaly, he deployed that exact phrase. He weaponized my profession against me. He used my trauma, my daily, grinding exposure to the absolute worst of humanity, to actively gaslight me into believing my own perception of reality was deeply flawed. I placed the silver lipstick gently on the glass coffee table. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just turned my back, walked back into the bathroom, and turned on the shower. I stood under the scalding water until my skin turned red, and as the dirt and sweat washed down the drain, a quiet, terrifying clarity washed over me. He was lying. I knew it. He knew it. The dog sleeping in the hallway probably knew it, but the dog was a golden retriever and prone to endless optimism. And that was the specific night I stopped being an active, loving participant in my marriage and started observing it like a sprawling, complex crime scene. Phase 4 of our marriage was an absolute masterclass in psychological warfare. Once I stopped arguing over the little things, once I purposefully went quiet and compliant, Julian fatally mistook my strategic silence for submission. He thought he had successfully managed me. He thought the threat was subdued. Emboldened by his perceived victory, he began to rapidly escalate his behavior, aggressively pushing the boundaries of his disrespect, testing the electric fences of my tolerance. The escalation happened in 10 distinct, agonizing beats, each one more brazen and cruel than the last. Beat 1, disrespect. We were at a lavish dinner party hosted by his mother, Eleanor. Eleanor was a wealthy, sharply dressed, judgmental woman who viewed me as a blue-collar, unfortunate mistake her golden son had made during a rebellious phase. We were sitting around her massive mahogany dining table, the air smelling of roasted lamb and expensive lilies. A family friend asked me how work at the department was going. Before I could even open my mouth to answer, Julian laughed loudly and cut me off. "Oh, Corinne just takes depressing pictures of roadkill and ruined lives all day," he said, taking a smug sip of his Cabernet. "I keep telling her she needs a real feminine hobby, something that doesn't involve yellow police tape and body bags." The table chuckled nervously. I looked at Julian. He didn't even glance back at me. He was performing for his mother, sacrificing my dignity for her approval. Beat 2, control. The very next week, Julian strolled into my home office. "Listen," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe, his hands in his pockets. "Your hours at the lab are so erratic, and you're always exhausted. I'm going to take over managing the household finances. The property taxes, the home insurance, all the bills. I'll just roll it into my firm's accounting software. It'll save you the massive headache." "I don't mind doing it," I said slowly, watching his body language. "I've always managed the house." "I insist," he smiled, though his eyes remained hard. "You need to relax." "I like knowing where we stand, Julian." "And you will," he countered smoothly. "I'll give you a monthly summary. Let me take care of you, Corinne." It wasn't a request. Within a week, all the physical mail from the bank was being forcefully routed to his private P.O. box downtown. I should have stopped it immediately. But my investigator brain kicked in. I needed to see exactly how far he would go. I needed the financial evidence to mature before I struck. Beat 3, the replacement. Sabrina started showing up at our house, not just for brief blueprint meetings, but casually, comfortably. I would come home from a 10-hour shift smelling like industrial chemicals and exhaust and find her lounging on my patio furniture, drinking my expensive Pinot Noir out of my crystal glasses, laughing brightly with my husband. "Oh, hey, Corinne," she'd chirp, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Julian and I were just brainstorming the new tile layout for the downtown loft project. "Looks like a very relaxing brainstorm," I replied, noting the empty wine bottle. "Julian works so hard," Sabrina cooed, touching his forearm lightly. "He needs a creative outlet." She smelled intensely like that damn Santal 33 perfume. The heavy, woody smell began to permeate my living room. It lingered offensively on the sofa cushions. It was a primal, territorial marking, plain and simple. Beat 4, public humiliation. 2 weeks later, Eleanor dropped by unannounced. Sabrina was already there, of course, sitting at the kitchen island. I was standing at the sink, quietly washing my travel coffee mug. Eleanor walked in, completely ignored my presence, and turned her glowing attention to Sabrina. "You know, Sabrina," Eleanor said loudly, ensuring her sharp voice carried perfectly over the sound of the running tap water. Julian desperately needs softness in his life. He builds beautiful, elegant things. He shouldn't be constantly surrounded by people who smell like formaldehyde and death. It heavily drains his creative spirit. Sabrina offered a sympathetic, deeply pitiful smile in my direction. It must be so incredibly hard to hold on to your femininity in a morbid job like that, she cooed. I manage, I said, my voice deadpan. Do you? Eleanor scoffed. Because Julian looks exhausted. I turned off the faucet. I didn't speak. I just dried my mug with a towel, walked silently past them, and went into my darkroom. Beat 5. Spatial violation. My darkroom was my absolute sanctuary. It was a small, converted spare bedroom where I developed personal black and white film. My actual hobby, the one Julian endlessly mocked. The room smelled of stop bath and developer fluid, a scent that grounded me. I came home one Tuesday afternoon to find the heavy door propped open. Sabrina was inside, casually moving my expensive chemical trays off the counter and stacking them on the floor. What the hell are you doing? I asked, my voice dropping an octave, a cold fury rising in my chest. She jumped, looking flustered, holding a box of my premium photo paper. Oh, hey! Julian said this room was just wasted space. We're going to put up some white shiplap and turn it into a brightly lit staging area for his architectural models. Put my trays down, I commanded. Julian said, I said put them down. Now. She dropped them onto the counter, her eyes wide with manufactured victimhood. He was literally giving away my personal sanctuary to his mistress, right in front of my face. Beat 6. The ally attack. Mistress. Desperate for a reality check, I called Julian's older brother, Trent, who had always been decent and grounded to me. I asked him to meet me for coffee at a quiet cafe. I told him I thought something was deeply wrong, that something was going on with Julian and Sabrina. Trent stirred his vanilla latte, looking intensely uncomfortable. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Look, Corinne, Trent sighed, staring at his spoon. Julian works incredibly hard. He carries a massive amount of stress for his firm. That doesn't explain the lipstick, Trent, or the fact that she's always at my house. Maybe if you were a little more present, Trent suggested, wincing slightly. A little less intense all the time? You're lucky he puts up with your dark moods and your weird hours. Just let him have his work friends. Don't ruin his peace by being a jealous nag. I tasted the bitter black coffee on my tongue. Trent knew. Eleanor knew. They were all completely complicit. They were a unified, impenetrable front protecting the family's golden boy at my expense. Beat 7. Institutional threat. The very next morning, Julian sat down at the sunlit breakfast table and casually slid a thick, legally binding document across the cool granite counter. What is this? I asked, staring at the blue legal cover. It's a transfer deed, he said casually, aggressively buttering his toast. My lawyer thinks it's best we move this house into one of my LLCs. Why would we do that? The house is paid off. It's in both our names. With your morbid job, you're constantly around legal liability, Julian explained smoothly, not looking up. If you ever get sued by a victim's family for messing up crime scene evidence or whatever, they could come after our house. This totally protects us. It shields the asset. You want my name off the deed to my own house? I asked evenly. It's just paperwork, Corinne. Don't be so dramatic. He wanted to strip my foundation away entirely. He wanted to legally erase me from the only safe harbor I had ever known. I'll read it over, I said evenly. I took the document. I didn't sign it. Beat 8. The cruelest moment. A few days later, seeking a moment of comfort, I went into the antique dining room hutch to polish my grandmother's silver spoons. They were the only physical items of value I had inherited from my chaotic, poverty-stricken childhood. The blue velvet box was gone. I tore the entire house apart. Frantic panic clawed at my throat. I confronted Julian the second he walked in from work. Where is the silver box? I demanded, my hands shaking with genuine adrenaline. The one from the hutch. Julian looked at me with deep, manufactured, sickening pity. Corinne, honey. You moved it last month, remember? You said you wanted to put it in the hot attic for safekeeping. No, I didn't. I never said that. I would never put silver in a damp attic. He stepped closer, placing his heavy hands condescendingly on my shoulders. His voice was soft, patronizing, completely lethal. You're forgetting things again, just like you completely forgot to pay the water bill last month. I think the severe stress of your job is finally breaking your mind, Corinne. I am not forgetting things, I whispered, stepping back from his touch. You're losing your grip on reality, he countered softly. Maybe you need to talk to a doctor, get a prescription, take some time off. He had taken them. He had either sold my grandmother's spoons to fund his lifestyle, or he had given them to Sabrina. And now he was looking me dead in the eyes and telling me I was clinically crazy. He was systematically trying to dismantle my sanity piece by piece. Beat 9. The digital lockout. The escalation reached a new level of physical control 3 days later. I came home at 1 a.m. after processing a brutal highway collision. The night air was freezing, dropping into the low 40s. I walked up to the front door exhausted, only to find the familiar brass deadbolt completely gone. In its place was a sleek, black digital smart lock. The keypad was dark. I had no physical key. I had no code. I stood in the freezing wind, my teeth chattering, and banged loudly on the heavy oak door. After 5 agonizing minutes, Julian finally opened it, wearing silk pajamas, looking sleepy and profoundly annoyed. You changed the locks? I asked, my voice trembling from the cold. I told you I was installing the new smart security system this morning, Julian sighed, rubbing his eyes. I texted you the master code. No, you didn't. I pulled out my phone, showing him the blank message thread. I checked my phone. There is no code. Julian shook his head, looking at me with that same sickening pity. I definitely sent it. You probably deleted it by accident. Your memory has been absolutely terrible lately, Corinne. You locked me out of my own house, Julian, in the middle of the night. Stop being so dramatic, he snapped, his patience evaporating. I'm trying to keep us safe from the creeps you work around. Now come inside, you're letting the freezing air in. He's testing the perimeter, my internal monologue screamed as I walked past him. He's seeing if he can physically bar me from my own property and make me apologize for the inconvenience. This is the exact moment most people break. This is the moment most people scream, throw heavy ceramic plates at the wall, and demand an immediate, messy divorce. I am not most people. I am a highly trained investigator of catastrophic, bloody messes. Beat 10. The breaking point. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Julian was out supposedly golfing with Trent. I was walking slowly down the hallway toward the master bedroom. The harsh afternoon light was hitting the wall at a severe, raking angle, casting sharp relief across the painted drywall. And I saw it. About 3 feet off the floor, right between 2 invisible studs. The physical texture of the wall was wrong. It was incredibly subtle. So subtle that 99% of humanity would walk past it every single day for a decade and never notice. But I spend my entire life staring at surfaces, looking for anomalies. The bumpy orange peel texture of the drywall was slightly smoother, slightly flatter, in a perfect 2x2 square. And the paint, a shade called Navajo white, was a microscopic fraction of a shade lighter. It hadn't had time to properly oxidize and fade like the rest of the hallway. There had been a patch, recently. I stopped dead in my tracks. I stared at the square. A liar always forgets one corner of the room. My mind spun rapidly backward, cross-referencing dates and times. When had Julian been alone in the house long enough to cut a square of drywall, patch it, mud it, sand it down, and paint it without me smelling the fumes? 2 weekends ago. I had been sent to a mandatory 3-day forensic photography conference in Phoenix. He had stayed home, claiming he was sick. I turned on my heel and walked purposefully into the garage. I opened his meticulously organized red rolling tool cabinet. I pulled out the heavy yellow Stanley crowbar. The steel felt cool and perfect in my grip. I walked back inside. I didn't hesitate. I didn't stop to think about the financial cost of repairing the wall. I planted my boots on the floorboards, swung the heavy crowbar back, and drove the sharp steel edge straight into the dead center of that slightly too smooth square. The impact jarred my shoulders. The brittle drywall crunched loudly. A cloud of fine white dust exploded into the stagnant air. I hooked the edge of the bar and ripped the chunk of gypsum board violently backward, exposing the dark, hollow, hidden space between the wooden studs. I pulled my tactical flashlight from my belt and shined the blinding LED beam into the void. There it was, the heavy, black, fireproof document bag. I reached in and pulled it out. My hands were immediately covered in white, chalky dust, but my pulse was completely steady. I unzipped the heavy metal teeth of the bag. Inside was the cream cardstock note. "We have the money. She suspects absolutely nothing. Friday we sign and the house is ours." But nestled securely beneath the arrogant note was the real, devastating bomb. It was a massive stack of complex loan documents from a private, predatory lending firm. Julian had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on our fully paid-off historic house. He had masterfully forged my signature on every single page. The official notary stamp belonged to Sabrina's cousin, a slimy guy who I knew worked at a cheap strip mall title company on the edge of town. The total loan amount printed in bold black ink was $725,900. I kept digging frantically through the bag. There were official bank routing numbers. The $725,900 had not gone into our joint checking account, nor had it gone into his legitimate bonded business account. It had been rapidly funneled into a newly formed shell LLC called S&J Desert Holdings. Sabrina and Julian. He hadn't just cheated on me. He had stolen my physical home. He had hollowed out my entire life's financial safety net to secretly fund a lavish new life with his young mistress, leaving me completely oblivious, holding the bag for nearly $750,000 in fraudulent, inescapable debt. I slowly sat down on the hardwood floor of the hallway. The white dust settled quietly onto the blue denim of my jeans. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. A strange, glacial, absolute calm settled over my racing brain. The agonizing confusion of the past year was instantly gone. The cruel gaslighting was over. The physical evidence was finally right here in my dusty hands, and the physical evidence never, ever lies. Julian thought I was just a sad woman who took pictures of roadkill. He fatally forgot that I am a master technician of ruin. He forgot that I know exactly, precisely how to build an unbreakable chain of custody. Phase 5 began in absolute, terrifying silence. I checked my watch. I had exactly 2 hours before Julian was due back from his fake golf game. I treated my own hallway like a Class A felony crime scene. I walked out to my county vehicle and pulled my heavy, reinforced black Pelican camera case from the trunk. I brought it inside, unlatching the heavy clasps. I took out my professional Nikon D850 and carefully attached my expensive 60mm macro lens. I screwed on the circular ring flash. I photographed the gaping hole in the wall with a yellow plastic scale marker, meticulously documenting the depth and the ragged, freshly cut edges of the drywall. I photographed the black bag exactly as I found it. I moved to the kitchen and laid out every single document on the granite island, using sterile metal tweezers to handle the corners so I wouldn't leave my own fingerprints. I shot high-resolution, brutally sharp, perfectly lit macro images of every one of my forged signatures. I photographed the fraudulent notary stamp. I photographed the damning bank routing numbers. Then, moving with practiced efficiency, I carefully packed the documents back into the bag. I put the bag back into the dark void in the wall. I went out to the garage, found a piece of scrap drywall, measured it, cut it to exact size with a utility knife, and screwed it securely into the hole. I taped the seams, applied a thick layer of quick-dry spackle, and hit it with a high-powered industrial heat gun to force the moisture out and make it dry in minutes. I sanded it perfectly smooth, the dust coating my arms. I found the half-empty can of Navajo white paint in the utility closet and rolled a flawless coat over the patch. By the time the front door opened and Julian walked through at exactly 6:30 p.m., the wall looked exactly as it had that morning. The only minor difference was that the hallway smelled faintly of fresh latex paint. "Hey," Julian said, dropping his heavy keys onto the granite counter. He sniffed the air. "Smells like chemicals in here. You bring your morbid work home with you again?" "Just doing some deep cleaning," I said, pouring myself a tall glass of ice water. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. I was entirely hollowed out, a machine operating on pure objective. "Right," he smirked condescendingly. "Well, I'm absolutely exhausted. Trent completely crushed me on the back nine." He hadn't been golfing. There was no red tan line on his forehead from his visor. His expensive white golf shoes, which he carried loosely in his left hand, had perfectly clean plastic spikes. No green grass clippings, no desert dirt. "I'm sure you had a very hard day," I said smoothly, taking a sip of my water. Over the next 3 agonizing weeks, I moved like a silent ghost through my own life. While Julian slept soundly next to me in our bed, oblivious to his impending doom, I was wide awake in the dark, methodically building an impenetrable fortress of destruction. I took my encrypted SD card of high-res photos to Elias, a brilliant, ruthless forensic accountant and attorney I had met while working on a massive white-collar crime task force years ago. I sat in his sterile, freezing office, drinking terrible, burnt coffee from a styrofoam cup, while he reviewed the horrifying images on his massive monitors. Elias leaned back in his leather chair and let out a low, impressed whistle. "This is a literal masterpiece of fraud, Corinne. The S&J LLC is registered in Delaware to hide the ownership, but the bank accounts receiving the funds are local." "Can you trace it all?" I asked, gripping the warm cup. "With these specific routing numbers?" Elias smiled a sharp, predatory grin. "Oh, I can trace it down to the literal penny. But it's actually much worse than you think. He's collateralizing against the equity of the house." "Meaning what?" "Meaning he's legally bleeding the equity out of your house to buy a multi-million-dollar luxury condo in Scottsdale in pure cash," Elias explained, pointing at a document. "He's planning to take the condo, walk away from this marriage, and leave you to default on the massive fraudulent loan. The bank takes your house. He takes the cash." A cold wave of revulsion washed over me. "I want to freeze it. All of it. I want an emergency federal injunction on the S&J LLC accounts. I want to report the slimy notary for wire fraud. And I want the divorce papers aggressively drafted, officially citing criminal financial abuse." Elias steepled his fingers, his eyes gleaming. "When do we strike?" I looked at the large paper calendar hanging on his office wall. "Julian's 40th birthday is in exactly 12 days. He's hosting a massive catered dinner party at our house. His entire family, his wealthy friends, his biggest investors. He's catering it with a private chef. He wants to show off his success." Elias's grin widened into a terrifying, shark-like expression. "I'll have the emergency paperwork ready. The trap will be legally flawless." During those endless 12 days, I played my assigned part flawlessly. I was the quiet, slightly beaten down, compliant wife. When Sabrina came over to help plan the party aesthetics, I smiled warmly and offered her imported sparkling water with lime. When Eleanor called to sharply remind me to wear something actually flattering and feminine for once, I politely thanked her for the excellent advice. I didn't feel anger anymore. Anger is a hot, sloppy emotion. I felt intense anticipation. The cold, mechanical, beautiful thrill of a steel trap snapping irrevocably shut. The night of the grand reversal was a beautiful Saturday. Tucson in late October is undeniably stunning. The brutal, suffocating summer heat finally breaks, and the cool evening air smells deeply of rain-washed creosote and cooling desert sand. Julian had gone all out for the party. The interior courtyard was strung with warm, glowing Edison bulbs. A professional jazz trio played softly in the corner, the low thrum of the upright bass vibrating in the air. The expensive caterers were serving rich braised short ribs, creamy truffle polenta, and endless bottles of vintage wine. There were 24 guests seated elegantly at the long, rustic wooden table directly under the ancient mesquite tree. Eleanor sat regally at the head of the table, dripping in heavy pearls and arrogance. Trent was seated next to her, laughing loudly at a joke. Sabrina was seated strategically close to Julian, wearing a stunning, backless silk dress, expertly playing the role of the indispensable, brilliant young colleague. Several of Julian's biggest, wealthiest investors were scattered among our mutual friends, eating the expensive food. Julian was entirely in his element. He was holding court, a heavy glass of expensive Barolo loosely in his hand, telling charming stories, soaking in the absolute admiration of his peers. Peak smugness. He looked around his beautiful, softly lit courtyard, his beautifully restored house surrounded by his sycophants, entirely convinced he had outsmarted everyone in the world, convinced he had beaten me. Dessert plates were finally cleared by the silent waitstaff. The jazz trio took a well-timed break. Julian stood up, his chair scraping against the terracotta, and clapped his hands together to command attention. "Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight," Julian announced, his rich, confident voice carrying perfectly over the quiet hum of the courtyard. "Turning 40 is a major milestone. It makes you deeply reflect on what you've built in this life. The structures, the relationships, reflect the foundation." He looked down the table at me, offering a fake, patronizing, camera-ready smile. "And I really have to thank my lovely wife, Corinne, for her endless patience as I work long hours to build my empire." Polite golf clap applause rippled around the long table. Sabrina smiled warmly at me, a sickening display of fake sisterhood. Eleanor visibly rolled her eyes and took a sip of her wine. "Actually," I said. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I just spoke, projecting my tone exactly the way I do when I am testifying on the stand in a crowded, hostile courtroom. Clear, calm, utterly unignorable. The table went dead quiet. Julian looked at me, his perfect smile faltering slightly at the edges. I wasn't supposed to speak. That wasn't in his carefully curated script. "I have a special gift for you tonight, Julian," I said, my voice ringing out in the cool air. "And a small, informative token for everyone here, to truly commemorate the foundation you've built." From beneath my chair, I pulled up a heavy black canvas tote bag. Inside were 24 identical, glossy, heavy-stock black folders. I handed the thick stack to Trent, who was sitting to my immediate left. "Pass these around, please, Trent." Trent, looking deeply confused, took one off the top and dutifully passed the rest down the line. Within 30 seconds, every single person at the table had a sleek black folder sitting right next to their crystal wine glass. Julian stared at his folder, a flicker of genuine, primal unease rapidly crossing his handsome features. "What on earth is this, Corinne?" Eleanor asked, eyeing the folder like it was glowing with radiation. "If it's more of your depressing, gruesome crime scene photography, I swear—" "Just open it, Eleanor," I said pleasantly, resting my hands on the table. The sound of 24 heavy cardstock covers opening simultaneously in the dead quiet courtyard was like the synchronized mechanical racking of 24 shotguns. For 3 agonizingly long seconds there was total, absolute silence. Just the sound of the desert wind rustling the yellow leaves in the mesquite tree overhead. Then, the reactions cascaded down the table like rapidly falling dominoes. Eleanor let out a sharp, strangulated gasp, her wrinkled hand flying violently to her chest, her pearls clacking together. Trent dropped his open folder onto the table as if it had burned him, his eyes wide, looking frantically from the paper to his brother in absolute, uncomprehending horror. Sabrina gasped and knocked her heavy wineglass over. The dark red Barolo shattered across the pristine white linen tablecloth, pooling rapidly like fresh arterial blood. One of Julian's primary financial investors, a stern, wealthy man named Marcus, pushed his heavy wooden chair back so violently it nearly tipped over. "What the absolute hell is this, Julian?" he roared. Inside every single folder was a meticulously curated, legally undeniable narrative of total ruin. Page 1. The high-resolution, perfectly lit macro photo of the forged deed, with a bright forensic red circle drawn around my faked signature, placed side by side with a legally verified, genuine signature from my driver's license. Page 2. The undeniable bank routing documents showing the exact, to the penny $725,900 transfer into the fraudulent S&J Desert Holdings account. Page 3. A crystal-clear, time-stamped, perfectly framed photo of the handwritten cardstock note. We have the money. She suspects absolutely nothing. Friday we sign and the house is ours. Page 4. A stamped official copy of the emergency federal court injunction filed by Elias that very morning at 8 a.m., officially and legally freezing every single asset tied to Julian Gable, his development firm, and Sabrina. Julian didn't even look down at the open folder in front of him. He didn't have to. He was staring dead at me. His face underwent a catastrophic structural collapse. The charming, arrogant, impenetrable mask completely dissolved, leaving behind a hollow, terrified, pathetic shell of a man. The blood rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly gray. His hands, gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table, began to shake so violently that the silver forks and knives rattled audibly against the plates. He opened his mouth, but no air seemed to reach his lungs. "Corinne," Julian whispered, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its bravado, sounding like a frightened child. What did you do?" I looked at him. I looked at the man who had stolen my grandmother's silver spoons, who had secretly tried to steal my only home, who had mocked my sanity to my face and laughed at my pain with his mistress. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't launch into a dramatic, emotional monologue. I gave him the ultimate, crushing punishment, absolute, clinical, forensic indifference. I stood up slowly, picked up my leather purse and pushed my chair in, making sure it was perfectly aligned with the table. "I'm just documenting the crime scene, Julian," I said quietly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "You forgot a corner." I turned my back on him and walked purposefully through the courtyard, my heels clicking rhythmically, mathematically, on the cracked terracotta tiles. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Behind me, the beautiful courtyard erupted into absolute, unmitigated chaos. Marcus was yelling at the top of his lungs about wire fraud. Eleanor was sobbing hysterically, demanding answers. Sabrina was crying, frantically trying to explain herself over the noise. The explosion was magnificent, but I was already out the heavy front door, stepping out into the cool, dark desert night, breathing clean, unpolluted air for the first time in long, suffocating years. Phase 7 is the aftermath, the long, slow, agonizing burn of legal consequences. When you detonate a forensic bomb of that massive magnitude in a tightly knit social and financial circle, the shrapnel violently hits everyone in the blast radius. Within 2 short weeks, Julian's once booming development firm completely collapsed. The wealthy investors, utterly terrified by the undeniable photographic proof of federal wire fraud and forgery, instantly pulled their funding from all his active commercial projects. The state licensing board permanently suspended his contractor's license pending a massive criminal investigation by the district attorney. Within a month, Sabrina vanished into thin air. When the S&J bank accounts were federally frozen, her luxury Scottsdale condo purchase immediately fell through. She realized Julian was no longer a wealthy golden goose. He was a massive, sinking anvil tied directly to her ankle. She blocked his phone number, packed up her bottles of Santal 33 and fled to Los Angeles, leaving him completely alone to face the terrifying music. The slimy notary, Sabrina's cousin, flipped on Julian immediately to avoid serving time in a federal penitentiary, loudly testifying to investigators that Julian had paid him $5,000 in raw cash to illegally stamp the forged loan documents. But the absolute sweetest, most poetic justice fell heavily upon Eleanor. During the grueling legal discovery phase, Elias uncovered a fascinating detail. Julian, desperate to secure the initial fraudulent loans before the big payout, had quietly used his mother's massive estate as collateral for a massive, high-interest bridge loan. When his firm violently went under and the accounts were completely frozen, the bank immediately called the loan due. Eleanor, the vicious woman who thought I wasn't classy or refined enough for her golden family, was legally forced to sell her beloved mahogany dining table, her expensive pearls, and her sprawling, pristine home just to avoid filing for total bankruptcy. She moved into a small, cramped, rented apartment on the dusty east side of town. I didn't keep the beautiful Spanish colonial. I legally could have. But it was permanently tainted. The energy was ruined. It was a crime scene. I sold it at a massive, booming market profit to a nice, oblivious family from out of state. I took my money, all of it, completely unburdened by Julian's massive debt, which the furious judge aggressively severed from me during the divorce, and I bought a smaller, older, perfectly quiet adobe house on the very edge of the Saguaro National Park. 3 months after the disastrous dinner party, I was sitting on the porch. My cell phone buzzed against the wooden table. It was an unknown number, but I knew exactly who it was. "Corinne, please," the desperate text read. "I have absolutely nothing left. The state is pressing felony fraud charges. My mom won't even speak to me. I'm living in a cheap motel by the highway. I know I messed up, but you destroyed my entire life over money. Can't we just talk? Please." I sat on the porch of my new house. The dry desert wind rustled the cacti. The sun was slowly setting over the jagged Catalina Mountains, painting the vast sky in violent, beautiful streaks of deep purple and bruised orange. I held a warm mug of hot tea in my hands. My dog, a lanky rescue greyhound, was sleeping peacefully at my feet, occasionally twitching his ears. I read the pathetic text again. I thought about the gritty feeling of the drywall dust coating my hands in that sweltering hallway. I thought about him looking me in the eye and telling me I was losing my grip on reality. I typed my final response. "You're seeing shadows, Julian." Then I hit send, and I permanently blocked the number forever. I stood up and went inside. My new house was perfectly, beautifully quiet. The thick adobe walls absorbed all the noise of the outside world. The concrete foundation was deep and solid. The legal deed, locked securely in my fireproof safe, had only one name printed on it: mine. I walked slowly past a framed photograph I had proudly hung in the hallway. It was a high-contrast black and white portrait I had taken many years ago of Detective Eris Thorne, sitting at his cluttered desk drinking his terrible, burnt coffee. I smiled, gently tapping the wooden frame with my index finger as I walked by. He was absolutely right. A liar always forgets one corner of the room. And God help them if the person they're lying to knows exactly where to look.